I need to tell you something before I start. I am not a soldier. I am not a scientist. I was not, at any point in this story, the most important person in the room. I want to be clear about that because people have a way of making these things bigger than they were, turning them into some kind of dramatic confrontation between species, some grand moment of humanity proving itself. It was that, but it was also messier than that, funnier, more embarrassing. And the smell, nobody ever mentions the smell in these stories, and I think that's a mistake, because the smell of burning Velcorath polymer and singed alien pride is something I will carry with me until I die. My name is Dara Osei. I was 26 years old. I was a teaching assistant, the lowest possible rank you can hold at the Galactic Academic Consortium Station Helios 7, which is the most prestigious learning institution in 4 star systems, which should tell you something about how institutions work regardless of what planet they're on. I was there because Earth had finally, after 11 years of political arguing and one very embarrassing incident involving a trade delegation and a misunderstanding about what finger food meant, secured 3 scholarship slots in the consortium's graduate-level xenobiology program. I was one of the 3. And I was, as of the morning this story begins, absolutely convinced I had made a terrible mistake. Section 2, the setup. Helios 7 is not what you imagine when someone says space station. People on Earth still picture space stations like something from old science fiction, long tubes, rotating rings, maybe some blinking lights. Utilitarian, efficient, cold. Helios 7 is none of those things. It sits at the gravitational midpoint between the Cathara Sun and its twin, a binary system about 34 light-years from Earth, and it has been growing, section by section, corridor by corridor, for approximately 400 years. Nobody is entirely sure of the exact number because the original construction records were kept by the Velcorath, who use a base 12 counting system and a concept of time that doesn't translate cleanly into any human calendar. What I can tell you is that by the time I arrived, Helios 7 had something like 42 distinct atmospheric zones. Different wings of the station maintained different air compositions, temperatures, pressures, and, critically, light spectrums, to accommodate the metabolic needs of whatever species was working or studying in that section. The human wings smelled like recycled oxygen and something faintly metallic, like a very clean hospital. I had been told before arrival that it would feel familiar. It did not. It felt like a simulation of familiar, like someone had looked at data describing Earth environments and then made their best guess. The gravity was slightly off. Not enough to notice when you were walking, but enough that after 2 days your legs felt strange, like you'd been walking on a beach your whole life and someone had quietly swapped the sand for carpet. There were 3 of us from Earth in the graduate program that year. Me, Dara Osei, specializing in comparative cellular biology. Priya Nair, tall, relentlessly cheerful, specializing in biochemical signaling between species. She had a habit of narrating her own observations out loud as though she was recording a documentary, which was either endearing or maddening depending on your mood. And Marcus Webb, shorter than me, broader, with the kind of face that always looked like it was 3 seconds away from a very dry joke. He was studying xenoimmunology. He had a master's degree from Johns Hopkins and had still somehow ended up as the most junior person in his lab cohort, because the Velcorath student he was assigned to work alongside had 3 doctorates, had published 47 papers, and was also, technically, only 19 years old by his species count. Marcus dealt with this through a combination of extremely dark humor and a truly heroic consumption of a caffeinated beverage the station's hydro kitchen had synthesized specifically for human metabolic needs. It tasted like coffee, the same way a photograph of a fire tastes like warmth. We had been on the station for 11 days when the lecture happened. Section 3, Professor Verkthos. Let me tell you about Professor Verkthos. Actually, let me tell you what it felt like to be in the same room as Professor Verkthos, because that communicates more. He was Velkorath, which means he was approximately 2.5 meters tall, with 6 articulated limbs, 4 for locomotion, 2 for manipulation, and a body structure that is roughly insectoid in the way that a medieval cathedral is roughly a building. Technically accurate, missing everything important. His exoskeleton shifted color with his mood, a feature the Velkorath called Kethshora, which translates loosely as emotional chromatics, and which humans found fascinating and slightly terrifying in equal measure. When Verkthos was pleased with something, the plates along his thorax rippled a deep, satisfied amber. When he was contemptuous, which, I would learn, was his most common emotional state, they went a flat, dismissive gray-green. He had been the head of the Consortium's Department of Comparative Xenobiology for 61 years. He had published over 300 academic papers. He had supervised, by his own count, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 graduate students. He didn't keep exact records of the ones from what he called the periphery species, which was a category that included humans, the Dreschen, and the Makvo, none of whom had been members of the consortium for more than 2 decades. He was, in the blunt assessment of every student I spoke to in my first week on the station, absolutely brilliant and absolutely insufferable. And the second quality was made worse by the fact that the first was completely justified. You couldn't dismiss him. That was the thing. When Verkthos told you your hypothesis was structurally unsound, it was structurally unsound. When he looked at your data and said you'd controlled for the wrong variables, you had controlled for the wrong variables. His contempt was not the contempt of an arrogant fool. It was the contempt of someone who had been right so many times that he had begun to confuse being right with being superior. There is a difference. It took me a while to articulate it, but the difference is this. Being right is about the work. Being superior is about the person. Verkthos had, somewhere in 61 years of being right, drifted from the first to the second without noticing. And humans, human biology specifically, were his favorite subject for contempt. Not because he'd studied it and found it wanting. I want to be precise here. Because he hadn't studied it at all and was confident that was fine. The lecture hall where this all began was called Meridian Auditorium, which was the galactic standard name. Students called it the Pit, because it was arranged in a descending semicircle, with the professor's dais at the lowest point and the seating rising steeply around it on all sides. You felt, sitting in it, like you were looking down into something. It seated roughly 300 students. The morning of the lecture, it was about 2/3 full. The class was Introduction to Multi-Species Physiological Systems, a required first-term course for all xenobiology graduate students regardless of origin species. The idea was to give everyone a foundation in how different bodies worked before they specialized. It was considered, by the senior students, a formality, a box to check. Verkthos had been teaching it for 40 years and had refined it into something extremely efficient and deeply unengaging. I sat next to Priya. Marcus was on my other side, already holding his coffee approximation and staring at the dais with the expression of a man attending a lecture he has already decided to be annoyed by. The hall filled up around us. Velkorath students, 6-limbed, color-shifting, moving with that uncanny fluid grace, occupied most of the seats. There were a handful of Dreschen who looked something like upright ferrets and communicated partly through scent, which made sitting near them in an enclosed space an interesting experience. 2 Makvo sat near the back, tall, translucent-skinned, with what appeared to be their circulatory systems visible through their chest walls. And us 3 humans, sitting in the middle of a room designed for beings who were emphatically not human, trying to look like we belonged there. Verkthos entered without ceremony. He simply appeared at the dais, which was his way, movement so efficient it felt like editing. He set down a data slate. He looked at the room. His thorax plates were already gray-green. Today, Verkthos said, in Galactic Standard, we address the mammalian circulatory paradigm. His voice was processed through a translation node embedded in the lecture hall's architecture, so we heard it in clean, unaccented Standard. I knew enough by then to watch his limb posture and chromatics rather than just listen to the words. The chromatics told you the tone. The words were just the surface. Before we begin, he said, I would like to use this opportunity to address a misconception that has, in my experience, prevented several cohorts of students from approaching this material with appropriate intellectual humility. He touched the data slate. A holographic diagram appeared above the dais, 3 meters tall, rotating slowly. It took me a second to recognize it. It was a human heart. Anatomically precise, beautifully rendered. 4 chambers, the great vessels, the valves, all of it, suspended in faintly glowing blue light, turning so the whole room could see it. This, Verkthos said, is the primary circulatory organ of the human species. A biological latecomer to the consortium, admitted 11 years ago, currently fielding 3 graduate students, which is the minimum threshold for species inclusion in the program. He paused, let that land. The human heart. He said it the way you might say, the cardboard box, when someone had described it as a sophisticated storage solution. It is, he continued, pulling up a second diagram alongside the first, something I recognized as a Velcorath vascular cluster, which bore approximately 0 resemblance to a heart and functioned through a completely different pressure mechanism. A single pump 4-chamber design, sequential, dependent. It operates continuously from approximately 3 weeks post-conception until death, with no redundancy, no regenerative capacity beyond scar tissue, and a failure rate that accounts for what I understand is the leading cause of death in the human species. He turned to face the room. A species that evolved to its current state of technological and civilizational development, while depending on a non-redundant, single point-of-failure pump to circulate its life medium. Several Velcorath students shifted. I noticed 2 of them exchanging a rapid chromatic exchange, something flickering between amusement and second-hand embarrassment. If I were to design a circulatory system, Verkthos said, I would not begin with this. I would not end with this. I would not arrive at this design through any intentional process. The only way to arrive at the human heart as a solution is through the blind optimization of a process with no foresight, constrained by the accidents of evolutionary history. He said all of this in an absolutely measured, academic tone, which somehow made it worse. Priya had gone very still beside me. Marcus was looking at the hologram of the heart, with an expression I couldn't quite read. I was doing the thing I always do when I'm angry and can't show it yet. I was taking very careful mental notes. Verkthos continued. He moved on to the human lung, 2-organ, non-redundant title, with a cross-pathway design that means the same passage is used for both respiration and alimentation, creating a mechanical conflict that has no equivalent in any species I would describe as optimized. And then to human bones, which he described as calcium scaffolding with a lifetime degradation curve that guarantees structural compromise in the final third of the organism's functional lifespan. He wasn't technically wrong about any of it. That was the maddening part. Everything he said was factually accurate. Human biology does have single points of failure. The esophagus and trachea do share a dangerous crossover. Bone density does decline. But there was something he was doing that I couldn't immediately name. It took me most of that section of the lecture to figure out what it was. He was describing human biology in isolation, without context, without evolutionary history, without the environmental pressures that shaped it, or the timescales involved, or the extraordinary things that design, that so-called primitive design, had managed to accomplish despite everything. He was doing the equivalent of picking up a river stone and calling it a poor building material, without acknowledging that it was not trying to be a building material, that it was very good at being a river stone, and that somehow a creature built of river stone equivalent parts had managed to get itself to this space station to sit in this lecture hall and listen to him be wrong about them. The other students, the Velkorath, the Dreschen, the Mach-Vo, were watching us. I could feel it. Not hostile, more like you watch someone when something slightly uncomfortable is happening and you're not sure whether to intervene or look away. One of the Velkorath students near the front, I would later learn her name was Sethar Voss, a second-year student who would become one of my closest friends on the station, had turned around in her seat and was looking at us with her chromatics cycling in a pattern I didn't yet know how to read. I learned later it meant something close to, "This is not how we are supposed to treat new species." Marcus put down his coffee. That was the first sign. The lecture moved into its second hour. Verkthos was now discussing the human immune system, which he had characterized as reactive rather than anticipatory, with a learning curve that requires actual pathogenic exposure to generate defenses, as opposed to the predictive modeling systems found in more developed species. He had a slide up comparing human antibody generation timelines with Velkorath immunological prepositioning, and the comparison was, visually, at least, not flattering to the human immune response. And then Marcus Webb raised his hand. "I need you to understand the weight of this action." This was not a lecture culture where hand-raising was common. The consortium's academic tradition, adopted from Velkorath Academic Convention, operated on a system where students submitted questions through their data slates for the professor to address at his discretion, at a time of his choosing, which often meant never. Active interruption of a lecture was considered a significant breach of decorum. In 11 days, I had not seen a single student raise a hand during a lecture. Marcus Webb's hand went up like a flag going up a pole, slow, deliberate, completely unbothered. Verkthos noticed it. His chromatics shifted, not to gray-green, to something I hadn't seen before, a kind of cold, pale blue that I later learned indicated something like bemused curiosity at an unexpected thing. "The human student has a query," Verkthos said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah," Marcus said, in English first, then switching to standard. "Sorry, yes, question." "The protocol." "I know the protocol," Marcus said, pleasantly, "but this is kind of time-sensitive." A ripple through the room, chromatic cycling. The two Dreschen near us were suddenly very attentive. Verkthos tilted his head, all four of his upper structure sensory appendages angling toward Marcus in the Velkorath equivalent of focused attention. "Proceed." "The immune system comparison," Marcus said, gesturing at the slide. "The one showing human antibody generation versus Velkorath immunological prepositioning." "Yes." "Can you tell me what the Velkorath prepositioning system does when it encounters a pathogen it hasn't pre-modeled?" A pause. Very short, maybe 2 seconds. But I had been watching Verkthos's chromatics the entire time, and in those 2 seconds his thorax plates did something I can only describe as a flicker. Not a full color change. A flicker. "It defaults to generalized inflammatory response," Verkthos said, "while the predictive modeling system updates." "How long does the update take?" "The initial calibration period is approximately another flicker, 6 to 8 of your Earth days." "And during those 6 to 8 days," Marcus said, still pleasantly, "what does the inflammatory response do to the host organism?" The room was completely silent. "It produces symptoms," Verkthos said. His tone had gone very careful, very measured. "Fever, systemic inflammation, cellular stress." "So," Marcus said, "for 6 to 8 days, The Velkorath immune system makes the host organism genuinely ill while it figures out what it's dealing with. Beat. Whereas the human immune system, the reactive one, the primitive one, starts generating targeted antibodies within 72 hours of novel pathogenic exposure and can produce a functional immune memory within 2 weeks, which means the second time the human body sees that pathogen, it kills it in hours. He paused. We also get sick, but our body is learning the whole time. It's not waiting for a model to update. It's building the solution in real time from scratch while it's under attack. He picked up his coffee. I just wanted to make sure I understood the comparison correctly. Verkthas did not respond for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. His chromatics had gone through 3 distinct phases in about 4 seconds. I caught pale blue, then something dark and complicated that I didn't have a word for, then back to gray-green, but a different gray-green than before. Warmer, less dismissive. More like the color of someone who has just stepped on something unexpected and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. The comparison, he said, was not intended to suggest that human immunity is without function. No, of course not, Marcus agreed. You were comparing design philosophies. I just thought the real-time adaptive synthesis was a relevant feature to include in that comparison. Another pause. It is, Verkthas said quietly. The Velkorath students near the front were not even pretending to look at their data slates. Sethar Voss had turned fully around in her seat. Verkthas moved on. He went back to the slide. He continued the lecture. But something had shifted. I noticed it in the way he held his presentation, slightly slower now, less declarative. The way a person recalibrates when they've realized, mid-performance, that the audience is more complicated than they thought. After the lecture, as we filed out of the pit, Priya grabbed my arm. Did he just, she started. Yes, I said. Marcus, she called ahead to him, that was. I know, Marcus said, without turning around. He was already looking at something on his data slate. You knew that about the Velkorath immune system? I asked. I looked it up last night, he said, after he scheduled this lecture. The title was Mammalian Circulatory Paradigm, but I figured he'd get to immunity eventually. He shrugged. He publishes everything he's going to say about 3 months before he says it. I just read his papers. I stared at him. He called us a biological latecomer, Marcus said, and now there was an edge under the casual tone. Not anger exactly, something sharper. I prefer to be prepared. 3 days after the lecture, I was assigned to Professor Verkthas's research laboratory. This was not something I had requested. It was standard procedure. All first-term graduate students rotated through 3 labs before selecting their primary research placement. My rotation schedule had me in Verkthas's lab for 4 weeks. I reported at 700 station time, which is the equivalent of a very early morning, to Lab Complex 7 in the Xenobiology wing. The lab was on the outer edge of the station, which meant it had full viewport access. A wall of transparent alloy looking out at the binary star system, both suns visible, the nearer one close enough to watch solar activity in real time. It was, visually, the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. I was trying not to let it show on my face when Verkthas arrived. He was already in his lab coat, a Velkorath garment that covered all 6 limbs and carried multiple integrated tool sheaths along the lower 4. He looked at me the way you look at furniture that has been placed in an inconvenient location. Osai, he said, pronounced it correctly, which surprised me. You are the cellular biology human. Yes, Professor. You will observe and document today. Touch nothing without explicit authorization. Ask questions through the standard request system. Understood. He turned to his workstation. I found a documentation position near the outer wall, close enough to the viewport that I could have pressed my hand against the glass and touched the binary star system with my fingertip, metaphorically speaking, and I set up my recording equipment and began to document. The lab was running 3 simultaneous experiments. The first was a comparative tissue resilience study, testing how different types of cellular membrane responded to rapid pressure changes. The second was a chemical signaling analysis, how different species cellular signaling molecules behaved in mixed species tissue samples. The third was something I couldn't immediately classify. It involved a piece of equipment I hadn't seen before, about the size of a refrigerator, covered in what appeared to be a very large number of input ports and indicator lights. Verkthas's 2 research assistants, both Velkorath, both senior students, moved around the lab with practiced efficiency. They communicated with Verkthas in rapid Velkorath, which my translation node caught only partially. I documented, I watched, I did not touch anything. By mid-morning, I had noticed something. The third experiment, the one with the large equipment, was producing readings that the assistants kept checking and then checking again. Not with excitement. With the specific quality of attention that means something is not behaving the way it should. I looked at my documentation feed. I looked at what I'd recorded. Then I pulled up everything I knew about Velkorath polymer synthesis from the courses I'd taken before arriving, and I started running a very quiet calculation in my head. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I was 11 days into my first term, in a foreign laboratory, under the supervision of a professor who considered my entire species a biological afterthought. But I kept watching, and the numbers I was running quietly in my head were starting to make me uncomfortable. That evening, the 3 of us ate together in the Human Wings dining area, a small room that smelled like recycled oxygen and the coffee approximation, and whatever the hydro kitchen had assembled from Earth food profiles that day. It had managed something that was approximately pasta. We were all choosing not to think too hard about how. I told them what I'd seen in the lab. The third experiment, I said, the big equipment, the readings they keep rechecking. What kind of readings? Priya asked. Pressure differentials, in the polymer synthesis chamber. I pushed my pasta approximation around. The equipment is running a synthesis process using Velkorath polymer base, the kind they use for lab containment structures. And the differential readings are unstable. How unstable? Marcus asked. I don't know enough about Velkorath polymer synthesis to say definitively, but the pattern of the instability, I paused. I've seen something similar in high-pressure organic compound synthesis back home, the same kind of drift. It means the substrate isn't maintaining equilibrium under process conditions. Meaning the material is accumulating stress faster than it's releasing it. I looked at both of them. In the systems I've worked with, that kind of drift either self-corrects as the process stabilizes, or it doesn't, and then you get a very rapid release. Priya put her fork down. Rapid release, she said, as in. Rapid release, I confirmed. As in the contained pressure finds an exit very quickly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Have you logged a concern? He asked. I tried submitting through the standard request system, got an automated acknowledgement, no response. Have you spoken to Verkthas directly? He doesn't take verbal queries from first-term students, I said. It's in the lab protocol documents I was given. Marcus stared at me. Dara, he said slowly, if you think something is wrong. I don't know that something is wrong, I said. I know that the readings are doing something I've seen once before in a similar context, and that time in the Earth lab, we caught it and corrected it before anything happened. But you don't know if Velkorath polymer synthesis works the same way as whatever you were working with on Earth. No, I said, I don't. We looked at each other across the table. I'll go back in the morning, I said. I'll watch the readings again. If they're still drifting, I'll try to escalate through a different channel." "Which channel?" Priya asked. "I'll figure that out," I said, which was a polite way of saying I had no idea. I was in the lab at 6:45, earlier than my assigned time. I told the door system I had documentation preparation to complete, which was technically true. The lab was quiet. One research assistant was present, the junior of the two, a Velkorath second year named Cathanrose, who nodded at me when I entered and returned to whatever he was doing. I went to my documentation station. I pulled up the overnight readings from the third experiment's equipment. The drift had not self-corrected. It had not gotten dramatically worse, but it had not corrected. The line on the pressure differential graph was moving in the same slow, persistent direction. Not a spike, not an alarm, just a quiet, steady accumulation that was going exactly where I did not want it to go. I sat there for a moment. Then I made a decision. I walked over to Cathanrose. "Excuse me," I said in standard. "I have a question about the synthesis chamber experiment. The one using Velkorath polymer substrate." He looked at me. His chromatics were neutral, pale yellow, which I'd learned meant something like polite curiosity without strong feeling. "You are the documentation student," he said. "Yes, I've been logging the pressure differential readings and I wanted to ask about the pattern." I showed him my data slate. "This drift in the differential, is this within expected parameters for the substrate you're using?" He looked at the slate. His chromatics changed, not dramatically, but the yellow deepened slightly toward something warmer. "The substrate," he said slowly, "is a modified polymer, new formulation. The professor developed it." "New formulation," I repeated. "Has it been run in this equipment before?" A pause. "This is the second trial run." "And the first trial run, what were the differential readings?" He looked at me more carefully now. His chromatics had shifted into something complicated. "The first trial run was terminated early due to inconsistent readings." "What kind of inconsistency?" "Similar to what you are showing me," he said after a moment. I held very still. Was there an analysis of why the readings were inconsistent in the first trial? The professor concluded that the inconsistency was within the variance range of a new material protocol. He decided to continue with the second trial. I looked at the data slate, then at the equipment humming quietly across the lab. "How long has this trial been running?" 31 hours. "And when did the first trial terminate?" He was quiet. 34 hours, he said. I put the data slate under my arm. "I think," I said as carefully as I could manage, "that someone should look at this." Verkthos arrived at 7:30. He came in the way he always did, that editing room efficiency of movement, already focused on whatever he was going to do, the rest of the room registering as peripheral. I was standing next to Cathanrose. Both of us were looking at the equipment. Verkthos registered this. "You are early," he said to me. "Yes," I said. "And you are not at your documentation station." "No, I'm sorry. I had a question about the third experiment." His chromatics shifted to gray-green. "Your questions are submitted through the standard system." "I submitted one yesterday. I didn't receive a response." I held up my data slate. "I think this is time-sensitive." A long pause. The kind of pause that communicates very clearly that the person pausing is deciding whether to be irritated or curious. He looked at Cathanrose. Cathanrose did a small chromatic confirmation, the Velkorath equivalent of a nod. Verkthos moved toward me. He took the data slate. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at the equipment. "This pattern," he said, "you recognized it." "I've seen something similar, in a different substrate, different process." "On Earth." "And what does it indicate in the systems you've worked with?" I told him exactly what I'd told Marcus and Priya the night before: non-redundant stress accumulation, substrate not maintaining equilibrium, the potential for rapid pressure release. Potential, he said. Yes, I could be wrong. The Velcorath polymer might behave differently. This might self-correct. I don't know the material well enough to be certain. I paused. But the first trial terminated at 34 hours and this trial is at 31. He was still looking at the equipment. His chromatics were doing something I had not seen before. Not gray-green, not amber. Something layered, shifting between colors I didn't have vocabulary for, cycling through them slowly, like a thought process made visible. The variance assumption, he said quietly, not to me, more to himself. Professor, I concluded that the inconsistency in the first trial was within acceptable variance for a new material. It is possible that conclusion was made without adequate baseline data for the formulation. He was quiet. It is possible I applied Velcorath polymer variance assumptions to a material that does not share those properties. I said nothing. I was very carefully not saying anything. You have documented the differential readings since yesterday. Everything since I arrived. I can pull the timestamp match progression. He looked at me. His chromatics settled into amber. Do so, he said. What happened in the next 40 minutes is both less dramatic and more important than what came after. Verkthas and I went through the data together. His two research assistants joined us. The lab's senior safety system was called up, a semi-autonomous monitoring AI that Velcorath Labs used for precisely this kind of analysis. The safety AI ran the numbers in about 90 seconds. Its conclusion was that the pressure differential in the synthesis chamber was projected to exceed containment threshold parameters within, and I remember this number very precisely, 47 minutes. After which, the equipment would experience a rapid, uncontrolled release of the accumulated pressure differential, which, in the confined space of a laboratory, would produce an event that the safety AI described in very polite and technical language, and which a human safety officer would have called an explosion. Verkthas ordered the experiment terminated. The shutdown procedure for the synthesis chamber took about 8 minutes. It had to be done in stages, bleeding off pressure gradually to avoid triggering the event during the shutdown itself. I stood by the documentation station and watched. The equipment powered down. The hum that had been so constant I'd stopped hearing it ceased. The indicator lights went dark. The lab was very quiet. Verkthas stood at the workstation for a long moment. Then he turned to me. Your name, he said, is Osai. Yes, Professor. You are studying cellular biology. Yes. He was quiet for another moment. His chromatics were amber and something else, something warm and complicated. The pattern recognition, he said. You connected what you observed here to what you knew from your home laboratory. Yes. Without knowing whether the connection was valid. I wasn't certain it was valid. I thought it was worth checking. He looked at the powered-down equipment. You were correct, he said. It was worth checking. He picked up his data slate. You may return to your documentation station, he said. I did. And that, I thought at the time, was the end of it. A quiet competence moment in a lab, not dramatic, not climactic. I was wrong. The explosion happened 3 days later. I have thought about that morning many times since. The specific quality of the silence before the equipment failed. The way a room full of beings from 4 different species all looked at each other and understood, at the same moment, that something had just gone very wrong. And the particular expression on Professor Verkthas's face, all 6 limbs going still, chromatic cycling through something I can only describe as the color of being forced to reconsider everything. I should tell you what happened in those 3 days. Because the explosion, and yes, there was absolutely an explosion, did not come out of nowhere. It was the product of 3 days of events that I was partly responsible for, which is something I've come to accept even though I also had to spend a while being annoyed about it. The morning after the shutdown of the first synthesis chamber, Verkthos redesigned the experiment. He scrapped the modified polymer formulation and went back to a base substrate. He filed a safety report with the station's laboratory oversight system, a report that, I learned from Keth Anrose, was the first such report Verkthos had filed in 11 years of running that lab. He also did something unexpected. He asked to see my documentation. All of it, not just the synthesis chamber readings, all the documentation I had produced in my first 2 days in his lab. Every observation, every logged data point, every note. I submitted it through the standard system and he reviewed it, and 2 hours later I received a message on my data slate. Short, formal, very Velkorath. It said, "Your observational methodology is non-standard and contains several assumptions that should be flagged as assumptions rather than conclusions. However, the cross-system pattern recognition is of interest. If you are willing, I would find it useful to discuss the methodology from your training that led to your identification of the differential readings." I read it 3 times. Then I showed it to Priya. She read it. "He's asking you to explain how you think," she said. "Yes. To him. Apparently." She looked at me, Dara. "He's been running that lab for 61 years. He's never asked a first-term student to explain their thought process." "I know. You realize that's—" "I know," I said. "I'm trying not to think about it too hard or I'll convince myself it means less than it does." Section 2. The Conversation. I met with Verkthos in his office, a room on the inner side of the laboratory complex, which meant it had no viewport but had been arranged with the specific Velkorath aesthetic that I can only describe as organized intensity. Every surface bearing exactly what was needed, nothing decorative, nothing arbitrary, everything optimized. He sat on a multi-limbed workstation that served as a chair equivalent. I sat on a human-proportioned seat that had clearly been obtained specifically for this meeting, which was a small gesture I noticed and did not mention. We talked for 2 hours. He asked me about the pattern recognition, specifically about what had made me connect the Velkorath polymer readings to something I'd seen in an Earth laboratory using completely different materials and a completely different process. I explained it as best I could, the shape of the drift, the rate of change. The specific signature that unstable substrate accumulation leaves on pressure readings, which is apparently consistent across multiple physical systems even when the underlying materials are very different. The same way a certain kind of structural stress looks similar in wood and in steel and in carbon fiber, if you know what you're looking for. You were trained to look for the pattern rather than the specific material, Verkthos said. I wasn't specifically trained for it. My supervisor on Earth, she had a rule. She said data is local but pattern is universal. She made us look at data from completely different fields and ask whether we recognized the shape of it. I paused. It seemed abstract at the time. I thought it was a philosophy exercise. But it was not. It wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. His chromatics were doing something meditative, a slow, deep amber with occasional warm pulses. "The Velkorath educational methodology," he said after a while, "emphasizes species-specific mastery, the depth of knowledge within a species' biological system before attempting cross-system comparison." He paused. "There is a strong argument for this approach. Cross-system assumptions are one of the most common sources of error in comparative xenobiology." "Yes," I said, "but the other side of that." "The other side," he said, "is that a student trained entirely in single-system mastery will not recognize when a pattern from outside their system is relevant." He looked at me. You recognized a pattern from outside the Velkorath system because you were not trained in the Velkorath system. Your ignorance of our specific material properties was, in this case, an advantage. It prevented you from dismissing the pattern as within-system variance. I thought about that. You concluded the first trial was within acceptable variance, I said, carefully, because you knew Velkorath polymer well enough to have a prior expectation for what variance looks like. Yes. And I didn't have that prior expectation, so the pattern looked anomalous to me. Yes. We looked at each other. That is, Verkthos said slowly, a more interesting finding than I expected from this conversation. Verkthos redesigned the synthesis experiment with a new substrate. He also, somewhat to the confusion of his research assistants, invited me to participate in the design rather than just document it. Not as an equal contributor. I want to be clear about that. I was still a first-term student with 11 days on the station and a working knowledge of comparative xenobiology that was, by any objective measure, extremely basic. But he asked me questions as he worked. Not rhetorical questions. Actual questions. What do you see in this reading? What does this parameter choice remind you of? If you were looking at this data with no preconceptions about the material, what would you predict? It was the most intellectually engaged I had felt since arriving on the station. Cathanrose watched this with what I came to understand was considerable surprise, communicated through a series of subtle chromatic shifts that I was only beginning to learn to read. The new experiment was set up on the second day. It used a conventional polymer substrate combined with a cross-species binder compound, something developed jointly by Velkorath and Dreschen chemists about 20 years earlier for multi-species laboratory applications. The synthesis chamber was recalibrated. The differential monitoring was enhanced. 2 additional safety sensors were added. By the third morning, the experiment was running and the readings were stable. We thought we were fine. We were not, in fact, fine. But that is where the other explosion came from. Not from the experiment Verkthos had redesigned, from the adjacent laboratory. Let me be very precise about what happened, because it gets confused in the retelling. The explosion was not in Verkthos's lab. The explosion was in Lab Complex 6, the Xenochemistry Lab 1 section over, separated from Verkthos's Xenobiology Lab by a reinforced wall and a common equipment storage area. Lab Complex 6 was running an experiment with a volatile reagent compound, a Dreschen-derived synthesis material called Vethkoras, which I later learned was classified as Class 2 unstable under the station's chemical handling protocols. The experiment was being run by a team of 4 senior students under the supervision of a faculty member who was, at that precise moment, not in the lab. What had happened, and this came out in the investigation afterward, was that the stabilizing agent for the Vethkoras had been mixed at the wrong concentration. Not dramatically wrong, about 8% below the required threshold, enough that it took several hours for the instability to develop to the point of being dangerous. The point of being dangerous happened at approximately 9:20 station time on the third morning of my lab rotation. I know the exact time because I was standing next to Verkthos, looking at our experiment's readings, when the wall of the equipment storage area between Lab 6 and Lab 7 went from solid to not solid in a very emphatic way. Section 5. What an explosion in a space station laboratory feels like. It feels like the building has decided to disagree with physics. There is no good way to describe it. The sound is not what you expect from an explosion. It's not the dramatic boom of action sequences. It is something more percussive and closer, like someone has struck the wall with something enormous, and the wall has responded by becoming briefly aerodynamic. The pressure wave hits you before the sound fully registers. Not enough to knock you down, the wall absorbed most of it, but enough to make your vision blur for a half second, and your inner ear completely lose any confidence about where the floor is. Then the alarms. Station Helios 7 has, I would learn, an extremely sophisticated emergency response system. It contains 42 atmospheric zones and 31 separate chemical handling areas, and approximately 6,000 inhabitants at any given time, from 17 different species with different physiological needs. The alarm system does not make a single uniform sound. Different tones for different emergencies, calibrated so that each species can hear the relevant frequencies. In that moment, several tones went off simultaneously. The effect was less like an alarm and more like the station had suddenly decided to express strong feelings. The equipment storage area had partly collapsed. The wall between it and Lab 7 had a crack in it that went from floor to ceiling, dramatic-looking but structurally sound. The wall had held. The wall between the storage area and Lab 6 had not held as well. I could see through the crack. The common door had been blown open and was now bent at an angle that no door should be into the storage area, and through to where the edge of Lab 6 was visible. There was smoke. The chemical kind, thick and a color that had no equivalent in my experience, not gray or black, but a deep luminescent violet that the Vethkora's compound apparently produced when combusting. Verkthas was already moving. I had not yet fully processed what was happening, and Verkthas was already at the emergency communications panel on the wall of his lab, activating a station-wide containment notification. His chromatics had gone to something I had not seen, a vivid, urgent red-orange that I immediately understood instinctively, the way you understand certain colors instinctively, to mean something like danger, act now. Laboratory 6, he said into the panel. Vethkora's synthesis failure, storage area partial collapse, initiating atmospheric isolation for corridor J7 through J11. His voice was completely steady. I looked around the lab. Cathanrose was at the emergency containment system for our own lab, a separate panel that sealed all of the lab's air exchange systems to prevent contaminated atmosphere from entering. The senior research assistant, Relvas, was checking the crack in the wall with a sensor wand. Structural integrity at 86%, Relvas said. Wall is holding. Atmospheric contamination, Verkthas asked. Trace Vethkora's decomposition compounds in the room atmosphere, below threshold. I was standing in the middle of the lab, holding my data slate. Verkthas turned and looked at me. Are you injured? He asked. No, I said. Are you capable of continued function? Which was the most Velkorath possible way to ask if I was okay. Yes, I said. What do you need? This is the part that matters most. The 4 students in Lab Complex 6 were not seriously injured. The explosion had been relatively contained, most of the force going into the shared storage area and away from the main lab space. But 2 of them had been in the storage area when the reaction triggered, retrieving materials, and they had been in the direct path of the pressure wave. The station's emergency medical team, a mixed-species unit with Velkorath coordinators and Dreschen field medics, supplemented by an AI triage system, was en route. But they were 4 minutes away, which is a very long time when 2 people are in a collapsed space with possible injuries, and the atmosphere around them is contaminated with decomposition compounds from a Class 2 volatile reagent. Verkthas could not enter the storage area. The contamination, while below dangerous threshold in the main lab, was above safe exposure for Velkorath biology in the storage area itself. The Vethkora's decomposition compounds had a specific interaction with Velkorath biochemistry, not immediately lethal, but acutely disruptive to the very precise chemical signaling systems that their immune and neurological functions depended on. He told me this in about 6 words. Then he looked at me. And I understood. The decomposition compounds, I said. Velkorath are sensitive, humans aren't. The interaction is species-specific. Human biochemistry does not use the same signaling pathway. He met my eyes with 3 of his 4 sensory appendages. You would need a rebreather for particulate. The chemical exposure itself would not harm you. Where's the rebreather? He had it out before I finished the sentence. A compact emergency unit from the lab's safety cabinet, universal design, fitted to my face in about 3 seconds by Keth Anrose, who was suddenly right there and helping with the straps. The structural collapse is partial, Verkthas said. The eastern bay of the storage area is accessible. You should be able to reach them. I nodded. You are not trained for emergency recovery, he said, which was the most precise thing he could have said. No, I said, tell me what to check. He told me, in 45 seconds, the most efficient briefing I had ever received. Airway, consciousness, limb stability. Don't move anyone who might have spinal involvement. Use the station's emergency communication device. He handed me one, a flat plate that I clipped to my wrist to relay condition to the medical team en route. Go, he said. I went. The storage area was not as destroyed as it looked from the outside. The pressure wave had moved through it and taken some of the wall infrastructure with it, but the main collapse was in one corner, ceiling panels, a shelving unit, some equipment. The violet smoke was thicker in here, but the rebreather was working, and my vision was clear. The 2 students were Velkorath. One of them, Teth Maris, I would later learn his name, was sitting upright against the far wall, conscious. His chromatics were completely muted, which I learned later is what happens to Velkorath chromatics under acute chemical exposure. The emotional color system goes gray and flat. He was holding his upper right manipulation limb at an angle that was clearly wrong. I'm from the next lab, I said in standard. Medical team is 4 minutes out. Can you tell me if you're in pain? He looked at me. His chromatics did something very faint, a pale flicker. Limb joint, he said, pressure impact. My colleague. The second student was in the corner where the shelving unit had fallen. Not buried. The unit had collapsed sideways and she was beside it, not under it, but she wasn't upright. I went to her. Her name was Vethanara. She was unconscious but breathing. I checked with the method Verkthas had described. Her chromatics were fully gray. One of her lower limbs was at a wrong angle. I activated the wrist communicator. This is Osai from Lab 7. I have 2 injured in the storage area. First, male, Velkorath, conscious, limb joint injury, upper right manipulation limb. Second, female, Velkorath, unconscious, breathing, suspected lower limb fracture. I looked at her. No visible head injury, but she's unresponsive. I'm not going to move either of them. A voice came back immediately, the medical team. They asked 3 questions. I answered them. They told me what to monitor. I stayed there, crouched next to Vethanara, one hand on the wrist communicator, the other holding my data slate still, absurdly, present, and I watched her breathe. And I counted the seconds, and I talked to Teth Maris to keep him conscious and oriented, and I waited. 3 minutes and 48 seconds. The medical team arrived. Section 9. The investigation. The station's emergency investigation process for laboratory incidents was, I would discover, extraordinarily fast and thorough. The Velkorath academic tradition, whatever its shortcomings in terms of how it treated new species, had an absolute zero-tolerance approach to safety failures, for the very practical reason that in an enclosed system of 42 atmospheric zones and multiple volatile chemical programs, a containment failure is not a local problem. Within 6 hours of the explosion, the investigation had identified the concentration error in the stabilizing agent. Within 12 hours, the investigation had also identified something else. Something that I had not anticipated being involved in. The investigation examined all recent laboratory activity in the J7 through J11 corridor. This included, because it was standard procedure, reviewing all safety notifications and communications filed in the 72 hours preceding the incident. Among those communications was Verkthas's safety report about the synthesis chamber in Lab 7, the one he had filed, his first in 11 years, 2 days before the explosion in Lab 6. And attached to that report was his communication with me, the one about my observational methodology and cross-system pattern recognition. The investigation team, sorting through 72 hours of laboratory communications, found a first-term human student safety concern about polymer synthesis readings, filed through the standard system and not immediately responded to, followed by a direct conversation with the laboratory's professor, followed by an emergency shutdown, followed by a complete redesign of the experiment. They also found my original submission, the one from the first afternoon, submitted through the standard request system that had generated an automated acknowledgement and nothing else. The investigation team, as it happened, contained one member I had not expected, the station's vice-chancellor for academic standards. An older Velkorath, decades older than Verkthas, moving with the particular deliberate quality of someone who has been in charge of things for a very long time. Her name was Chancellor Verathkas. She wanted to speak with me. We met in a formal reception room in the station's administrative wing. The room had viewports on 2 sides and was maintained at a temperature and atmosphere that accommodated multiple species. It smelled faintly of something clean and complex that I eventually identified as an artificially maintained scent designed to be neutral across all consortium species. Chancellor Verathkas was accompanied by 2 members of the investigation team. She was not accompanied by Verkthas. She began by asking me to walk through everything. Starting from my first day in the lab, through the differential readings, through the conversation with Kethanros, through the meeting with Verkthas, through the shutdown, through the 3 days afterward, through the explosion and what I'd done in the storage area. I walked through it. She listened without interrupting. Her chromatics were very still, deep amber with a very slow, measured cycle, the chromatics of someone who is thinking carefully. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. The first was, when you identified the anomalous readings, what made you decide to pursue the matter despite the protocol barrier to direct verbal inquiry? I thought about how to answer that. The barrier is there for good reasons, I said. First-term students asking questions disrupts a running lab. I understand why it's standard practice to filter queries through the system. I paused. But I had submitted a query through the system, and it hadn't been addressed, and the readings were still drifting, and I had a calculation in my head about what the drift implied, and I decided that the discomfort of breaking protocol was smaller than the risk of doing nothing. She was quiet. The second trial was at 31 hours, I said. The first trial had been terminated at 34. I didn't have a lot of time to decide whether to be polite about it. Her chromatics shifted slightly, warm. The second question, she said, in the storage area. You entered an environment with chemical contamination to which Velkorath staff were sensitive, to provide initial response to 2 injured Velkorath students. Can you explain that decision? I thought about this one less carefully than the first. They were injured and alone, I said. The medical team was 4 minutes out. I could be in the room safely and they couldn't. It wasn't a complicated decision. Was it frightening? I paused. Yes, I said, but not in a way that was relevant to what needed to happen. She looked at me for a long moment. You understand, she said, that the 2 questions I have asked you are the same question. I thought about that. Protocol serves the general case, I said. When the specific case doesn't fit the protocol, You have to think about what the protocol was trying to accomplish, and do that instead. A very long silence. Yes, Chancellor Verathkos said. The investigation concluded. The students from Lab 6 recovered. Vethanara had a fractured lower limb joint and was out of the lab for 2 weeks, but no neurological involvement, no lasting damage. Teth Maris was back in a week. The faculty member who had been absent from Lab 6 during the experiment received a formal academic censure. The concentration error in the stabilizing agent was attributed to a procedural gap in the student team's training protocols, and 3 new protocols were added to the xenochemistry lab's procedures. Lab 7, Verkthos's lab, received no censure. His safety report, filed before the incident, and the shutdown of the synthesis chamber 2 days before the explosion were noted in the investigation record. My rebreather-assisted entry into the storage area was noted. 8 days after the explosion, I arrived at the lab for my final week of the rotation. Verkthos was already there. He did not greet me when I came in. He was at the workstation working. I went to the documentation station and set up. After about 20 minutes he spoke. "Oh, Sci. Yes, Professor. The cross-system pattern recognition methodology, the one you described, your supervisor's approach. Data is local, pattern is universal. Yes. I would like to include it as a supplementary component in the advanced xenobiology curriculum." He paused. "If you are willing to collaborate on the framework." I looked up from my data slate. He was still facing his workstation, not looking at me. His chromatics were doing the complicated layered thing, the thinking out loud colors. "I'm a first-term student," I said. "I am aware of that." The curriculum collaboration would typically involve faculty with established. "I am proposing it," he said, which ended that line of reasoning very efficiently. I was quiet for a moment. "I'd be glad to," I said. He nodded, turned back to his workstation. Then, after a moment, he said something that I have thought about many times since. I stated in the first lecture of the term that the human species had been admitted to the consortium at the minimum threshold for species inclusion. He paused. This was accurate. You fielded 3 graduate students. Yes, I said. It was not, however, a relevant observation for an academic lecture. Threshold metrics measure entry conditions. They do not measure capacity. I didn't say anything. The differential readings in my synthesis chamber were within a range that I had categorized, on the basis of 400 years of Velcorath polymer research, as acceptable variance. A student with 11 days of experience at this institution, from a species that joined the consortium 11 years ago, identified that categorization as incorrect. On the basis of a pattern learned in a field I had not examined. He paused. I applied known system assumptions to an unknown system problem. You did not. His chromatics settled into something I had not seen before, a deep, quiet amber without the layering, without the cycling, just warm, still. Your biology, he said, is not poorly designed. It is differently optimized. I was not applying the appropriate analytical framework. A long quiet. I should have said so during the lecture, he said, rather than waiting for your laboratory rotation to provide a demonstration. I sat with that for a moment. To be fair, I said, the demonstration was pretty effective. There was a pause. And then I would not have believed this, and Marcus didn't believe me when I told him, and even Priya looked skeptical, and I don't blame any of them, because I was standing 2 meters away, and I still half didn't believe it. Professor Verkthos, 61-year head of the Department of Comparative Xenobiology at the Galactic Academic Consortium Station Helios 7, 312 published academic papers, 4,000 to 5,000 graduate students supervised. Made a sound that I can only describe as a very brief, very contained, very controlled laugh. His chromatics went gold. Just for a second. I stayed on Helios 7 for 3 years. Marcus completed his xenoimmunology work and published a paper in his second year that specifically addressed the novel pathogen response gap in the Velkorath immune system's predictive modeling protocol. The same gap he'd raised in the lecture hall that first week, with his hand up and his coffee in his lap. The paper received more citations in its first 6 months than most papers receive in a decade. Priya discovered something in her biochemical signaling work that ended up being incorporated into a cross-species medical protocol for station emergencies. A diagnostic framework for quickly identifying which chemical exposures were dangerous to which species, specifically calibrated for the kind of multi-atmosphere environment that Helios 7 represented. It was, she said, the most useful thing she'd ever done. She said it somewhat smugly, which was entirely appropriate. I collaborated with Verkthos on the cross-system pattern recognition framework. It took 14 months and about 300 hours of work, and at least 40 arguments about methodology, several of which were heated enough that Kethanrose would quietly leave the room and come back 20 minutes later pretending nothing had happened. The framework was published as a dual-authored paper, his name first because of the academic convention, my name second. It was the first paper in the Department of Comparative Xenobiology's 400-year history to list a human researcher as a co-author. Sethar Vos, the Velkorath student who had turned around in her seat during that first lecture, whose chromatics had said this is not how we treat new species in a language I was only beginning to learn, became one of my closest friends. She came to the paper's release event and stood next to me while people asked questions, and she translated the chromatic subtext of the room for me in real time, quietly, into my left ear. "The senior faculty are impressed," she murmured. "Good impressed or reluctant impressed?" "Reluctant impressed, which for them is more significant." Vethanara, the student I'd pulled a rebreather on in the storage area, found me about 3 weeks after the explosion. She was still walking with a stabilizer brace on her lower limb. She stood in front of me in the corridor outside the lab and said, in standard, "I understand I was unconscious when you came into the storage area, but I am told you remained with me until the medical team arrived." "Yes," I said. "Thank you," she said. She said it very formally, very specifically, the way you say something when you mean it precisely and not approximately. "You're welcome," I said. She nodded. Then she said, "I would like to buy you something to eat. There is a Dreschen food synthesizer in Block C that produces something edible by humans. I am told it is acceptable." "It's actually pretty good," I said. "Then we will go," she said. Section 13, the lecture 1 year later. A year after the explosion, Verkthos gave his Introduction to Multi-Species Physiological Systems lecture again. New cohort, same pit, same dais. By that time, I was a second-year student, and the story of the first lecture, Marcus's hand going up, the immune system exchange, the synthesis chamber, the storage area, had circulated through the station in the particular way that stories circulate through enclosed communities, which is to say that it had been told many times and in many versions, and some of the versions had become considerably more dramatic than the actual events. And at least one version involved me personally dismantling the synthesis chamber with my hands while the explosion was happening, which was not accurate but was, I admit, more interesting. I heard about the second lecture from Sethar Vos, who attended it. She sent me a message afterward. "He still discussed the human heart," she wrote. But the framing was different. He described it as an example of evolutionary optimization under constraint, how a non-redundant design becomes adaptive when paired with an organism capable of behavioral compensation, medical intervention, and collaborative survival. He spent 20 minutes on it, more than any other system in the lecture. She added after a pause, "His chromatics during this section were amber, not gray-green. I thought you would want to know. I read that in my shared quarters, sitting on the edge of my bunk, with the view through the corridor window showing the binary star system doing something extraordinary with the light. Both suns at an angle that turned the space between them into something that looked like held breath. I thought about my supervisor's rule. Data is local, pattern is universal. I thought about a professor who had been right so many times that he'd stopped looking for the ways he might be wrong. I thought about Marcus with his hand up in the lecture hall, about Priya narrating everything out loud as though she was recording it for later, about a storage area with violet smoke and 2 injured students, and a specific quality of silence before the medical team arrived. I thought about what it had meant to be the lowest-ranked person in the room, and to have the information that mattered anyway. Section 14. The ending. There is a thing that happens, I've learned, when a species is new to something. When you're new to a room, a conversation, a system of doing things, you see it differently than the people who have been there for centuries. You don't see it better. You don't see it worse. You see it without the assumptions that familiarity builds. The Vel'Korath had been doing xenobiology for 400 years. They were extraordinary at it. Verkthos was extraordinary at it. The depth of their knowledge, the precision, the rigor, the accumulated understanding, was not something I could match after 3 years on Helios 7, let alone 11 days. But 400 years is also long enough to build very confident assumptions. Long enough that certain patterns stop looking like assumptions and start looking like facts. Long enough that when something arrives from outside the system, the first instinct is to explain it in terms of the system rather than to ask whether the system is complete. We were not smarter than them. I want to be very precise about this. We were newer. And newness, it turns out, is not always a deficit. The human heart is not a badly designed pump. It is a pump that evolved under specific constraints, gravity, atmosphere, a particular biological history, and optimized for a body that would compensate for its vulnerabilities through behavioral intelligence, social cooperation, and a willingness to dismantle and rebuild its own understanding of itself when evidence required it. I am not sure Verkthos ever entirely forgave us for the lecture hall moment. He was too precise for forgiveness of something he still believed had been a factually defensible position, delivered with somewhat excessive confidence. What he did instead was more interesting. He incorporated it, made it part of his methodology, started asking questions he'd stopped asking, because for 60 years he'd known all the answers. That's a harder thing to do than admitting you were wrong. That's deciding to be a student again. When I left Helios 7 after my 3rd year, the paper published, the framework adopted, a recommendation from Verkthos in my file that Setharvos described as not warm by most standards but extremely warm by his. I stood in the departure bay for a while before boarding. The station was huge around me, 42 atmospheric zones, 31 chemical handling areas, 6,000 inhabitants, 400 years of doing things a certain way, and then the slow, difficult, interesting work of doing them differently. I didn't feel proud exactly. I felt the way you feel when something has happened that is larger than what you did in it, when the thing that mattered was not your particular competence or bravery or intelligence, but the fact that you happened to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right piece of information, and you decided to say something. And then the explosion helped. The explosion always helps. The departure announcement sounded. I picked up my bag,